One seemingly ordinary morning, Ottawa released a brief statement through international news agencies, just a few short lines, but enough to send shockwaves through the U.S. defense industry. Canada, the neighbor, the close ally, the longtime battlefield companion of Washington for the past century, had chosen a different path. Instead of signing a multi-billion-dollar deal with American defense giants like usual, they decided to place their trust in a European consortium. For the first time in decades, a major defense project completely shut the U.S. out of the negotiation room. The ripple effect of that decision echoed louder than any diplomatic speech. It wasn't just a weapons procurement deal. It was a cold, clear message. Canada no longer automatically sees Washington as its only option. For American defense contractors, long accustomed to being the default supplier for allies, the news landed like a punch to the face. On the stock market, shares of Lockheed Martin and Boeing took a nosedive. In assembly plants across Texas and Missouri, thousands of stunned workers began asking, what does the future hold for us now? And behind it all, one big question emerged. Why did Ottawa dare to turn its back on Washington? Was this merely an economic decision or a carefully calculated strategic pivot? Let's rewind to that explosive moment when Ottawa unexpectedly unleashed a political and military lightning strike that not only cracked the foundation of bilateral ties, but also set off unpredictable chain reactions across the entire American alliance system. The moment Ottawa announced its decision was like a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. At a press conference that was far from grand, the Canadian government declared it would partner with a coalition of European manufacturers to develop and supply its next-generation fighter jets. The aircraft would be assembled right in Montreal, while key components and technologies would come from across Europe. Wings from Sweden, radar systems from Germany, avionics from France. A multinational tapestry with not a trace of American involvement. Behind that decision lay a sharp political message. Canada wants to reduce its dependence on Washington and redraw its own strategic horizon. This wasn't just about a multi-billion-dollar contract. It was the reversal of a habit forged over decades. Ever since World War II, the U.S. has been the default seller whenever an ally needed fighter jets, from the F-16 to the F-35. That default was erased in a single sentence, leaving the Pentagon stunned. To them, Canada wasn't just a client, it was a symbol of strategic trust. Losing Canada in a major defense deal felt like having your closest friend slam the door in your face. Tensions in Washington rose immediately. Defense officials whispered in the hallways, analysts flooded television screens. One message rang clear. This wasn't just a financial blow. It was a strike at America's technological credibility and the trust it once commanded. On social media, questions swirled. Has Washington grown too complacent? Have tariffs and a hardline stance toward Ottawa pushed an ally straight into Europe's arms? But while politicians debated, Ottawa's lightning bolt had already struck far beyond the corridors of power. It hit the everyday lives of ordinary people. American workers who had spent their careers in weapons manufacturing, because the first and most direct impact wasn't felt at the Pentagon, but in the production lines of Fort Worth, Texas, and St. Louis, Missouri, where generations of workers had taken pride in building the very backbone of Western air power. And it was there, in those factories, that the pain of Ottawa's decision began to spread, becoming a fracture in the heart of America, one that may not be easily healed. Fort Worth, Texas, long hailed as the heart of America's aerospace industry, suddenly fell into a heavy silence. The assembly lines, once lit around the clock and alive with the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the quick steps of workers, had begun to slow. News of Canada's decision spread like an oil slick, and in every workshop, every small diner nearby, worry was written on people's faces. Thousands of Lockheed Martin workers now faced the looming threat of shift cuts, or worse, losing their jobs altogether. These were people who had spent their lives with steel, titanium, and every bolt of those flying machines, now staring down the possibility of being cast aside because of a decision made across the border. It wasn't just Fort Worth. St. Louis, home of Boeing Defense, was gripped by the same anxiety. A city once proud to be the birthplace of the legendary FA-18 now watched as contracts slipped from its grasp. Aluminum suppliers, electronics firms, avionics manufacturers across Missouri and neighboring states began to consider the possibility of collapse cascading down the supply chain. A single major contract didn't just sustain tens of thousands of direct jobs, it kept alive the entire ecosystem of subcontractors, food joints, and small businesses clustered around the factories. Now, all of it felt as fragile as a spider's web caught in a sudden gust of wind. In working-class neighborhoods, people began to wonder whether local schools would have enough funding to keep art and sports programs alive, as tax revenue from the industrial zones dwindled. Cafes that used to be packed with engineers and workers during lunch breaks now sat eerily quiet. Restaurant owners looked toward the factory gates with dread, where the steady stream of people had thinned to a trickle. An older worker in Fort Worth said somberly, "We used to believe we were helping protect the free world. Now I don't even know how to protect my own family's future." These scenes painted a painful truth. The moment Ottawa signed that deal with Europe, the numbers on a page instantly translated into instability on dinner tables across American working families. And the bitterest pill was the sense of helplessness, because workers had no power to reverse the political and economic decisions made in places they would never set foot in. From Fort Worth to St. Louis, from giant factories to humble diners, the pain spread quietly but deeply, leaving behind fractures not only in the local economy, but in national pride. A pride that had been built on symbols of technological dominance, the F-16s, the F-A-18s, the F-35s, now faced its most severe test. And as Canada turned away, the question was no longer just about jobs. It was about American technological credibility on the global stage, where every steel wing was once a symbol of strength and trust. For decades, when people spoke of Western military might, names like the F-16, F-A-18, and F-35 were held up as untouchable icons. These weren't just fighter jets. They were proof of a technological superpower at its peak, and a promise that aligning with America meant access to the most advanced weaponry in the world. Every time those engines roared across the sky, it wasn't just the sound of steel and fuel. It was the sound of American technological dominance echoing across the globe. But when Ottawa chose to sideline American contractors in this historic deal, the blow wasn't just the loss of a contract. It cracked the very image Washington had spent decades crafting, that of the arsenal of democracy, always at the forefront, always leading by default. For the first time, a close ally no longer saw American fighter jets as the automatic choice. And that hurt more than any financial figure, because it struck at the core of national pride. People began to ask, were the very policies imposed by Washington, tariffs on steel, aluminum, and aerospace components, slowly eroding the trust between allies? In its zeal for protectionism, had America unwittingly shot itself in the foot? Because weapons aren't sold on price and technology alone, they're sold on trust and long-term partnership. And when that trust begins to wobble, not even the finest stealth coating can hide the cracks. This isn't just an industrial concern, it's a blow to national credibility. And once that credibility is tested, the consequences won't stop at the factory floor or the trading desk. They'll seep into the halls of power. In the U.S. Congress, where every senator's voice is tied to the votes of millions, a wave of outrage is already building. And there, the tough questions will be hurled directly at the White House. How did a deal this big, right in front of us, just slip through our fingers? In Washington, fiery hearings erupted within the chambers of Congress. From Texas and Missouri to Michigan, lawmakers rose in unison to challenge the administration. How could a contract worth tens of billions, right here on North American soil, slip through America's fingers? Their questions weren't just about economics, they were about national honor. Because for their constituents, this wasn't just dry language in a defense report. It was dinner on the table, a roof over their heads, a job now under direct threat. Representatives from aerospace-heavy states found themselves under enormous pressure. They knew that every vote they cast was now intertwined with the fate of thousands of working-class families. One wrong move, one act of silence, could cost them dearly in the upcoming elections. In the corridors of Congress, bitter whispers grew louder. We were warned that these tariff policies would push allies away, but no one listened. Meanwhile, the White House and the Pentagon appeared rattled. They scrambled to offer reassurances that America still holds the technological edge, that this was just an exception. But those reassurances rang hollow. Across the media, images of laid-off workers, idle factories, and angry lawmakers dominated the headlines, digging deeper into a growing political wound. The once unshakable faith in America's defense industry was now wavering, and it was happening on home soil. And while Washington scrambled to manage the internal fallout, the outside world watched with a mix of surprise and calculation. Because if Canada, America's closest ally, could turn its back, then others were bound to ask, if Ottawa can do it, why can't we? And from that moment, a global domino effect began to spread, quietly but unmistakably, threatening to reshape the very strategic landscape America once held firmly in its grasp. When Ottawa put pen to paper on its deal with Europe, the aftershocks didn't stop at the Canada-U.S. border. Around the world, nations weighing plans to modernize their air forces immediately took notice. In Warsaw, Polish defense planners, long reliant on Washington to shore up NATO's eastern flank, began to ask, should we continue placing our full trust in the U.S., or is it time to look more seriously at Europe's Eurofighter? In Tokyo and Canberra, closed-door meetings centered around the same question. If Canada can confidently step out from under America's shadow, then why should Japan or Australia, with their own robust technology and finances, limit themselves to a single path? That same energy soon reached Seoul, where South Korea faces the urgent need to replace its aging fleet of fighter jets. The South Korean government and military, traditionally heavily reliant on U.S. technology, began calculating a multi-source scenario, a way to avoid total dependency, because in an increasingly unpredictable world, entrusting national security to a single partner is no longer seen as the safe choice. In Europe, Canada's decision landed like a shot of adrenaline. The next-generation fighter program, led by France, Germany, and Spain, once doubted for its ability to compete, suddenly gained unprecedented legitimacy. The message Ottawa sent to the world was clear. Europe is no longer just a backup plan. It can be a central force in supplying air power to the Western Alliance. The economic boost to companies like Airbus and Saab is obvious, but beyond that, the European Union now holds a new political lever on the global chessboard. But the domino effect didn't stop in Europe or Asia. It struck at the very roots of NATO itself. As each allied nation begins to consider different fighter platforms, the prospect of a fragmented NATO emerges. Imagine, in a future crisis, squadrons from Poland, Germany, Italy, even Canada, all flying on different platforms, different engines, different radars, incompatible weapon systems. Interoperability, long NATO's greatest strength, could erode simply due to a lack of standardization. And once that cohesion weakens, the very foundation of collective defense becomes more fragile than ever. That's why this isn't just about a lost contract. It's the start of a broader shift in trust, a moment when allies stop viewing Washington as the automatic answer and begin reaching for alternatives. From this point on, the story is no longer just about diplomacy or military tech. It's a dual challenge, geopolitical and economic, a blow America must now reckon with in the months and perhaps years to come. The aerospace industry has long been a cornerstone of American pride, not only because of its cutting-edge technology, but because it stands as one of the few sectors that consistently delivers a trade surplus. Every defense contract signed with an ally doesn't just sustain hundreds of thousands of jobs at home. It fuels a steady flow of titanium, aluminum, electronics, software, and radar orders across the nation. So when Canada turned away, that intricate supply chain was suddenly at risk. Metallurgical plants in Ohio, electronics workshops in California, precision machining companies in Michigan, all were pulled into a vortex of uncertainty, despite never appearing in any press conference in Ottawa. What's more troubling is that for years, defense exports have acted as a shadow bank for America's R&D programs. Breakthroughs in stealth technology, ultra-quiet engines, and advanced radar systems have all, in part, been funded by steady contracts with allies. When orders from Canada, one of the most reliable and long-standing customers, vanish, the budget for research and development takes an immediate hit. This doesn't just threaten one deal, it undermines the very foundation of America's future technological dominance. And the ripple effects don't stop there. America's trade balance also takes a blow. Losing a multi-billion-dollar defense contract means that the foreign currency once expected to flow in now heads to Europe instead. At a time when Washington is already grappling with a persistent trade deficit and the challenge of maintaining the strength of the US dollar, this becomes a double hit: a loss in economic gain and a strategic challenge to American influence. Because every dollar lost in arms trade is also a fragment of America's soft power eroded on the global stage. But perhaps the most profound impact isn't found in numbers. Behind the contracts and supply chains, this is ultimately a battle over trust and perception. When even close allies begin to drift away, the question echoing through the halls of power and increasingly among the American public is this: is the image of the arsenal of democracy still intact? And that's where the true reckoning begins, not just with economics or geopolitics, but with the very heart of how America sees itself. For over a century, the United States has crafted its image as the arsenal of democracy, a place where wings of steel soared to defend freedom across the globe. From the Wright brothers' first flight to the mighty F-16s of the Cold War and the cutting-edge stealth of the F-35, each has become more than just a military achievement. They are symbols of national pride. It's a story Americans have long believed in, and one their allies believed in too. But when a close nation like Canada dares to turn away, that image suddenly feels more fragile than ever. Doubts begin to surface. If even a neighbor, a longtime security partner, no longer sees Washington as the default choice, who else might follow? The unease goes deeper than economic loss. It stems from a growing fear that America's leadership role is being quietly challenged by those it once considered most loyal. Among the American public, the pride once fueled by the roar of jet engines now wrestles with a creeping sense of doubt. And in the eyes of the world, the glow of American technological supremacy and political credibility no longer shines as brightly. That is the harshest blow of all. Not the loss of a contract, but the fracture of trust. An intangible asset, yet one that determines everything about a nation's standing on the global stage. Washington now stands at a crossroads no one quite anticipated. The US still possesses unmatched technological advantages: powerful jet engines, stealth capabilities, cutting-edge radar systems. But these strengths alone can't hold trust together. Because in today's world, weapons are no longer chosen solely for their power, but for the reliability of the alliances behind them. A lost contract can be replaced, but once trust is fractured, it leaves behind a wound that's hard to heal. Washington faces two paths: either recalibrate its trade and diplomatic policies, working to rebuild ties with allies who once stood shoulder to shoulder through countless conflicts, or stay on its hardened course and watch as strategic markets quietly slip into the hands of others. The decision made today will shape not only the future of America's defense industry, but its global leadership role for decades to come. And perhaps the most alarming thing isn't the contract that slipped away. It's the quiet, steady erosion of trust now spreading across the globe. Because when trust leaves a superpower, it rarely comes back. What do you think about this turning point for Washington? Can America regain the trust it's lost? Or will it continue down a path of confrontation and decline? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next geopolitical analysis.